So welcome. Welcome again for those of you who are on live with us this evening. I'm Loralee Scott, founder and director of the Sophia Center for Transformative Learning, and I am really thrilled and honored to be introducing or reintroducing for most of you probably Rick Tarnas and just the incredible body of work and scholarship that he will be sharing just a little bit of with us this evening as the first in this series of the Sophia Talks. As I'm thinking about Sophia, and many of you out there are, I'm sure, familiar with the archetype of Sophia, but I think she's one of the more elusive archetypes when we think about Sophia. I said to someone the other day, it's a little bit like trying to see or describe the wind. You kind of have to see it based on what it's moving. And Sophia, of course, one of the archetypal dominants for Sophia is the wind. In Hebrew, she's ruach, and in the New Testament Greek, she's the rushing mighty wind. She's the wind of the Holy Spirit. Her symbol dominants are many: the owl, the lion, the dove. And I thought I'd open, before we get into introducing Rick, I want to open with something, Rick, that you have in the epilogue of your book, The Passion of the Western Mind, that I think is so in line with what I refer to as the Sophia consciousness. And you wrote this, decades ago, right?
33 years ago.
Wow. All right. So
Yeah.
so let me just share a little bit of what you wrote in the epilogue of that book that is so relevant for this conversation tonight. You write this: "For the deepest passion of the Western mind has been to reunite with the ground of its own being. The driving impulse of the West's masculine consciousness has been its dialectical quest not only to realize itself, to forge its own autonomy, but also, finally, to come to terms with the great feminine principle in life, and thus to recover its connection with the whole, to differentiate itself from, but then rediscover and reunite with the feminine, with the mystery of life, of nature, of soul." And beautiful, eloquent words, and so profound in their depth. And I want to share that relative to a piece in Jung's Red Book that I believe also is speaking to a Sophia consciousness without mentioning Sophia. And again, this is going back to that dynamic of learning and being able to recognize her without really seeing her overtly and having her named. Jung writes this in the Red Book. He says, "If you remain within arbitrary and artificially created boundaries, you will walk as between two high walls. You do not see the immensity of the world. But if you break down the walls that confine your view, and if the immensity and its endless uncertainty inspire you with fear, then the ancient sleeper awakens in you, whose messenger is the white bird. Then you need the message of the old tamer of chaos." So you're recognizing some of the Sophia symbolism in this writing. "There in the whirl of chaos dwells eternal wonder. Your world begins to become wonderful. Man belongs not only to an ordered world, he also belongs in the wonder world of his soul." And lastly, so we're going from Rick Tarnas to Carl Jung to the Book of Proverbs in the introduction tonight, because in the Book of Proverbs, we see that symbolism of Sophia, right? The holy, wise one, the wisdom. And in Proverbs, it says this, and I think about this after watching, and we're not going to go there in this conversation unless Rick wants to take us there politically, but this stands in contrast for me to some of what I was watching and hearing in the last few days. "Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses, at the openings of the gates in the city. She speaks her words. How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge." Sophia, the archetype of Sophia is it's an archetype that's rooted, I believe, in an ethic of wisdom and compassion, among a number of other things, but I think wisdom and compassion. And so tonight, as we go into this conversation with Rick, I hope we can hold that temenos of wisdom and compassion that I believe now more than ever is needed in this epoch and in this moment of history. And I do believe, and Rick, I'm hoping you will you will confirm that we are seeing an emergence of this. So I'm really wanting to get to what you have to say. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Rick Tarnas or with his work in scholarship, Rick is the founding director of the graduate program in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at California Institute of Integral Studies, where he currently teaches. He is the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, which I just quoted from, which was a bestseller. He's the author of Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New World View, which received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network in the UK. He's formerly president of the International Transpersonal Association, and he's on the board of governors for C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. And I'm also honored and thrilled to count him as a dear friend. And Rick, I will say this, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. We'll jump right into this, but I will say this. One of the things that I think I, in particular, especially have come to appreciate about Rick is not only the tremendous, both the breadth and the depth of his scholarship, but the way in which he brings it to us with such a gracious spirit of both generosity and humility. And Rick, I really appreciate that about you and really respect that in you. And I am thrilled that you said yes to this invitation. And I'm thrilled and honored that you are launching this first of many of the Sophia Talks. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. That's a very kind introduction and welcome. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. So in the first question this evening, what are some ways in which a Jungian archetypal perspective can help illuminate the politically polarized times we are in?
Yeah, that's something that I think all of us who have an education in or a kind of soul foundation in the depth psychological tradition. And by depth psychology, I'm thinking of all the, whether it's Jungian, it's archetypal psychology that James Hillman in particular kind of pioneered. It's the transpersonal psychology as well. All those psychologies that have a depth dimension, that recognize that there's deeper things going on below the surface of consciousness that come from the deep psyche, and pretty universally when we go deep into the psyche, we start to see that there's powerful archetypal complexes and patterns and forms and figures that are shaping our psyche from within and in a sense from without, which is one of the points that Jung made with synchronicities, that these things, the archetypal domain is not just inside the human cranium. We live in soul. The soul isn't in us, and the more I think we are right now coming into an awareness of how much we are living within an earth community that is sentient through and through, that's not just populated by human subjects, it's populated by subjects of animals and plants and mountains and oceans that have moral consideration on our part. So in all that sense, there's I'm trying to begin with just getting a sense for how the archetypal perspective rooted in the deep psyche is something that is not just a human subjective concern. It's something that we are navigating ourselves through in a kind of larger matrix or anima mundi, soul of the world. So from that perspective, it's quite something to see Of course, the issue of can we shine a light on our current moment in history using this kind of a perspective. Any responsible answer to that would be one that would take more time than we could do in the next hour. But just to set out a few basic thoughts. One is, I mean, it's very clear that we're in a kind of multidimensional crisis, and it's a crisis of vision as much as anything else. And when you have a crisis of vision, a crisis of paradigm, it also reflects worldviews create worlds. It's not how we experience the world and how we the assumptions through which we are kind of filtering what we see in the world. Those not only are being kind of shaped by deep psychological archetypal factors, but they also can have an effect going out into the world by how we act, in the same way that in a relationship, when we bring forward an attitude of trust, that calls forth or elicits a whole different relationship in coming from the other person's participation in this field than would happen if you start off from a position of suspicion or hostility, aggressive critique or something like that. So right away, we can see how much if we think of the world in a particular way, it has consequences. Now, a lot of our crisis today can be seen as because it's happening ecologically, politically, economically, socially, spiritually, on all these levels. It makes it has many people kind of questioning, like, who are we and where are we going, and for those of us in the United States, what kind of a country are we? What are our ethical values that we're going to see as determinative for how we say organize our political life? And even more, as a species, it makes us wonder, who are we as a species that could be having here this most apparently brilliant of species, Homo sapiens, that has, and also this most apparently brilliant of civilizations, Western civilization, modern civilization, seems to have produced such a catastrophic global crisis that, it makes us question, well, who are we as a species and who are we as a civilization? So in all these ways, there's a kind of fundamental identity crisis that is in many ways, which in a way puts it too shallowly, because a profound psycho-spiritual identity crisis has a quality of it pulls the foundations out from your experience of life and your sense of orientation within it. So it's a kind of, in all these ways, it points to a kind of initiation. If you think of the initiatory rites of passage that were characteristic of most indigenous traditional societies, and if you think of what Jung described as the individuation process, or if you think of what Stan Grof described as the perinatal, the death rebirth process, or near-death experiences that have such a profound effect on how people live after they've gone through it. In all those contexts, we see a profound sense of an old identity is dying, and as that identity dies, it can feel in some ways like the whole world is dying. Um, and uh, and there's a great deal of uncertainty that tends to be part of those rituals, by the way, just as there's a great deal of uncertainty when a person is in a spiritual crisis or emergency, like, am I
Well,
going to get out of it?
yeah, I mean, and so again, this idea of, I like how you termed it a psycho-spiritual identity crisis. I mean, that's part, it is part of the archetypal mythology of Sophia, who's hurled into the abyss of chaos, right? Which is, that abyss of chaos is the beginning of a creative emergence, right? It's part of that,
That's exactly right. Yeah.
yeah.
There's I mean, because part of this transformational crucible that I think we are in, but is also characteristic of any psychospiritual crisis, any initiatory ritual, um, uh, the hero's journey, as Campbell and others unpack. Something that's fundamental to that is there's a descent. There's a descent into chaos, into the underworld, into a loss of one's previous orientation. When the previous structures no longer seem adequate, or they've collapsed in one way or another. And that actually seems to be completely necessary for a true profound transformation. There has to be a kind of ego death. There has to be we in the same way that when we are born, we lose the womb, we lose the universe that had held us and contained us and had nurtured us until until it could no longer, and in some ways, just as we must lose the womb in order to be born, which is a kind of paradise lost that is necessary for a rebirth into a paradise regained. So also, there's a fundamental way in which we have to die into life, as Goethe put it. We have to, in the same, we fall into love. There's an unusual way in which, a paradoxical way in which the opposites connect at this deep level. And what seems to be what we most are afraid of can often turn into the opening to something that could not otherwise emerge unless we had gone through such a dark night of the soul. Now,
Right.
that being said,
Go ahead.
well, let me just say one more thing, and that is, we're seeing all these signs of a kind of collective death rebirth process, a kind of initiatory descent and transformation. But for the first time in human history, this is being played out on such a vast global level and with such profound consequences for not only the human community, but the entire Earth community. We now have a whole nother level of spiritual and moral responsibility for how we respond to this, and whether we do something that is a real danger in these circumstances, which is to, for example, project the shadow elements that emerge at such a time, and to put it all on immigrants, or on a particular race, or on the xenophobic kind of response. That kind of response has much more profound, concrete consequences than if one is just a single individual going through one's personal, spiritual crisis. So we really are in a deep transformational crucible in which I think communities such as yours, the Sophia community that you're constellating here, to me represent a crucial, I call them heroic communities. We need heroic communities that have, by heroic, I mean have a vision of the good that is sharply different from what the mainstream society may be holding. And it takes, you can't do this alone. We have to hold space for each other to go through our deep transformations. It's an emotionally challenging thing. So you need a community for that, to be able to tap into these deeper archetypal meanings. But you also have to, we also have to do it as a community and as multiple communities, because individuals alone can't sustain the imaginative and spiritual vision in a disenchanted universe that the mainstream worldview has kind of laid out as being the starting point. So it really takes a kind of collective effort.
That's beautiful. I mean, I love what you're saying about that communal support. I mean, that's such a big part of the vision for the Sophia Center, is finding a way to establish these transformative learning communities that are engaged not only in passing information and knowledge and data, but in establishing a relational temenos where individuals see each other, and it's different and distinct from this kind of toxic political toxicity that we've gotten accustomed, unfortunately, I think, to seeing monopolized.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Okay, so I'm just looking at the clockwork. We haven't gotten past question number 1 yet, but that's okay. It's all good.
Let's go into all the other ones.
It's all good. So let me ask you this. Listening to what you're talking about, I mean, are we witnessing, a type of collective reorientation or evolution of consciousness? Is that overstating what we're experiencing? Because, and I want to qualify that by saying, it feels like and looks like on the global world stage, we're seeing two almost antithetical types of world leadership models, where there's the historical, traditional, patriarchal model that's based on power and domination. And then we're seeing it in Finland with the newly elected 34-year-old prime minister, in New Zealand, in Slovakia, in Greece. And it's not just that, but this other model that I'm looking at is more of that Sophia consciousness that's more about collaboration and connection and influence and concern for the marginalized. And it's not that it has to come through a woman. I think you could arguably say Trudeau probably subscribes to this when you look at him politically. How do we understand this push and pull? Is it a tug of war?
It is indeed a tug of war. And of course, whenever you have a pressure moving towards a new vision, a new paradigm, that activates the resistance of the old paradigm of the vested established interests, or those who have benefited from a privileged status quo. It takes a profound moral, it takes a high level of moral capacity for self-transcendence to not hold on to the power that you have been accustomed to. So, and much more likely is this tendency towards digging in one's heels. That's part of it. But part of it also, Jung was very insightful about when there is the emergence of what he called the self archetype, with that capital S. The opposites tend to constellate with greater intensity, and the tension of opposites gets to heightened extremes, so that there's a feeling of like being crucified, on the cross of opposites, as he would talk about it. So to some extent, what we're seeing in the world reflects, I think, that constellating of intensified polar opposition, which is a necessary prelude to the possibility of a movement onto another level that integrates or synthesizes. So that's part of it. I think also an important factor in this is that sense of great uncertainty that all of us feel, and the sense that there's a danger that is, you know, very present, and are we going to make it through? And that seems to be something that is also, I mean, not to understate the existential challenge that each of us feels in our own lives and in our responsibility for the collective, like a young woman, 15-year-old girl like Greta Thunberg, you know, just is carrying that sense of the collective moral responsibility. She's so archetypal. I mean, she's just like the perfect counterpoint to, you know, to Trump in particular, who recognizes it and is constantly, you know, bothered by her. But in any case, that's all of us who are looking at that bigger picture and taking in our, what can we do, and our concern for the future, our anxiety about it. What kind of a world are our children or grandchildren going to have? That sense of uncertainty, that too seems to be critical for the psychological and moral transformation to occur. You know, just as a person who has a truly close, like near-death experience, very few people have a deep near-death experience without changing their essential values in life, what they think is important. It just completely reconfigures their whole sort of moral frame of reference, how they're going to live their lives. Well, that could not happen unless you really thought everything was at stake. Well, we really think everything is at stake, and therefore the possibilities for a profound transformation within the entire human field is, I think, at greater now than ever.
Wow. Wow. So let's move from that into, you know, the archetypal and the astrological influences that are, you know, that are influencing us in this particular moment in time. Can you talk to us a little bit? I know in you know, lectures you're talking about how we're in a period of similar in some ways to the period we were in the 60s, and even, I think, even really fascinating for me is the 30s. Yeah.
Those are
Can you
the
talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, those are the two preceding periods. Let me just preface this by saying, you know, Jung himself was, of course, very deeply interested in astrology and studied it very, very intensively throughout his life, and used it in his clinical work and so forth. Although I had the greatest respect for Jung, I couldn't see exactly how astrology could particularly be of value to us until during the decade I spent at Esalen Institute and was working with Stan Grof, and we were dealing with the whole, you know, many people who were going through deep transformational experiences. And to make a long story short, to both of our astonishment, we found that the frame of reference that provided us with the most illumination for understanding what archetypal energies were active in a particular person or in the collective field, and at what time, turned out to be astrology, which yeah, just to both of us, it seemed like, well, that was like the last of the esoteric or new paradigm kinds of systems that we thought we would take seriously, but often the great spiritual treasures hide in the most humble places. So that being said, we're right now in the last part of for the last 12 years approximately. We've been going through an alignment where Pluto and Uranus came into one of the major aspects or alignments. This one is the 90-degree square alignment. Those two were last in such an alignment, the conjunction, actually, in 1960 to 72, approximately. And then the preceding one before that was the preceding square of the 1930s. And in all of these cases, so you get the Uranus, the planet Uranus seems to be associated with the archetypal principle of the impulse for radical change, for freedom, for rebellion, reform, to move towards the future, towards the new. It has a trickster quality. It acts suddenly in unpredictable and unexpected ways. It has a connection to youth, to overthrowing the status quo, and so forth. Pluto, on the other hand, has to do with, it's like the Pluto, Hades, Dionysus trinity from Greek thought, Greek myth, but you also have, Kali is a very good example of the Plutonic as well. Pluto has to do with the deep biological, chthonic, instinctual energies of transformation of both life and death, like both Hades and Dionysus, as Heraclitus put it. And whenever Pluto comes into, gets activated just on its own, there tends to be very profound transformations happen, but also kind of descents into the underworld are very typical. Just think of the 30s underworld, you know, the mobsters and so forth, the Al Capones and so forth. Or think of the 60s with the Godfather movies coming out, and there even have some of that energy very distinctive even in the rhetoric and language of our present incumbent. Mm-hmm. But more generally, Pluto tends to greatly impel or intensify whatever other archetype it's coming into relationship with. In this case, that one I described with Uranus. And so typically when these two planets come together, they synchronistically, I'm not saying they're causing these things to happen, but they seem to happen in remarkable synchronistic coincidence with the French Revolution, by the way, was another period where they were in alignment, 1787 to 1798. These periods, they last for about 10, 12, 13 years, and they tend to coincide with these periods of tremendous kind of revolutionary upheaval, social and political turmoil, great impulse to, there's revolutions of both the left and the right. There's, on the positive side, there's just a deep striving for change and for reform. The women's movement tends to consistently environmental, ecological, women's movements, civil rights movements, as in the 60s, as in the 30s as well. Think of Simone de Beauvoir or Virginia Woolf, and if you go back to the preceding ones, which I won't go into, one of the big ones was the one surrounding the period of 1848 with the great women's suffrage conference or meeting that in Seneca Falls, New York, as well as the height of the abolitionist movement and so forth with Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. So you can see these, every time they come into alignment, there is this empowerment of the impulse for reform and change and and liberation of those who have been marginalized and that type of thing. But at the same time, there's a shadow side. For example, the Plutonic, that shadow side of this kind of eruption of like the id, of the collective id, of the underworld, not just literal criminal underworld or urban underworld, but it's also the underworld of the deep psyche that can release all sorts of demons, and it can create large kind of mob activity. The 30s and the 60s both had that. I mean, even I was at many peace and anti-war demonstrations in the 60s, and they so readily went from nonviolent into violence, coming from both sides. It wasn't always the police or the military that were violent. It came from both sides. It was constellated in the, of course, the French Revolution is the ultimate example of that combination of impulse for freedom, revolution, but also the eruption of violent instinct. So we've got that for going, and roughly 2007 to 2020 is the period that we have been undergoing this. So we've had Obama as president, we've had great empowerment of women, et cetera. But we've also had this, this eruption of extremely, problematic social and political impulses. The other big alignment that we're going through right now, which is shorter but extremely intense, is a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which began about 2 years ago, and we have another 2 years to go. We're right at the heart of it, and Saturn has much more the sense of like a contraction and limits, and Saturn's a very complex archetype. It's the Senex archetype. It's the principle of structure, foundations, discipline, endings of things, maturity, but it also is the archetype of oppression and punishment and constriction and reactionary conservatism. And you put Saturn and Pluto together, and it tends to create periods of extreme pressure and weightiness. People feel like this kind of time period has tremendous weighty consequences that that one can wake up almost feeling heavy just dealing with it. Jung was born with the square, so he of Saturn and Pluto. So he, I mean, not only was he able to name the shadow, which is another part of this complex, but he was also had such a sense of the gravitas of our lives and the moral gravity of people feel like they're carrying the weight of history with them, and that a lot weighs on us according to the decisions we're making. Now, another quality that goes with the Saturn-Pluto complex, however, is that it can forge a certain moral courage in facing the shadow and in holding the tension of opposites, so that there is more of a capacity to hold one's kind of moral strength in the face of dire circumstances or even perilous, dangerous circumstances. So I see it's getting darker here, speaking of darkness, from the California sun going down.
We can see you, yeah.
So anyway, this Saturn-Pluto period can bring about a greater than usual sense of kind of girding one's loins and entering into a critical situation with courage and inner discipline, and it can be a period where one can build foundations, often against great resistance, that will but the foundations will be of structures that will endure.
Hmm.
I'll just say one last thing, and let's then ask you to, your thoughts or further questions. But
Mm-hmm.
a good way of thinking of the Saturn-Pluto combination, because Saturn is the contraction of things, and Pluto is the propulsion of things. Both of them are very much connected to the birth process, both the death process and the birth process, and the Saturn-Pluto combination tends to, part of it is a sense that there's an ending of an era, there's a dying going on, but it's both a dying crisis, but also a birthing crisis. It's a hard labor of birth, and if you think of all of you who have been mothers, of the almost titanic strength and force of both the contractions and the propulsion that is possessing the body as one is bringing forth this new life, and it can feel like utterly serious, just like, when one's in the full grip of it, like nothing's
Oh, all the women on this call who've given birth know what you're talking about.
yeah. So the only reason I can speak about it at all, not being at your all your elevated, and I mean this sincerely, elevated stature, is that I've had a number of experiences in my own, psychedelic sessions and so forth, and kind of initiatory, where I've gone into labor, become my own mother, giving birth to myself, and you get a sense for it,
Mm-hmm.
as well as being present at my children's births.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of, I mean, in some ways, I almost feel like Gaia and the great mother archetype is undergoing a kind of birth process in which we are participating in it, and we're partly the mother and we're partly the baby
Yeah.
that's being
Wow.
born.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's fascinating. This idea of the contraction and the propulsion. And I guess the $1,000,000 question, of course, would be, what are we going to ultimately give birth to? And, and how do we influence, how do we become a part of it? Can we become a part of influencing what is born into the collective consciousness and what is coming through, and how do we do that? So, wow. Okay. I want to move to, we're headed into the last kind of 15 minutes of this, Rick, and these ideas and these thoughts that you're sharing. I mean, the overlap and the connection between the astrological and the archetypal are fascinating, and that's a big part of your work. So as you're talking about, I'm thinking archetypally, and as you're talking of, the archetypal revolutionary at one end of the spectrum versus the, you kept mentioning the gangster. I think Linda Shirley Leonard in her book corresponds with the archetype of the revolutionary and the archetype of the terrorist as being opposite ends of the same spectrum.
Right, who overlap at times.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to talk about, I have two questions I want to make sure we get to, but let me ask you this one and then we'll get to the last one. But you've talked about something you call, and I'm reading my notes because I want to get this right, synchronistic convergences of archetypally connected phenomena across all aspects of culture and society and in the natural environment. Those are your words, right?
Yeah, you can. Those must have been written words. They're not the kind of thing that one would
you were
say.
speaking. No, you were inspired. You were speaking when that came out. Okay,
Well,
so, but can you give us an example or kind of some short, in shorthand, what you're talking about by these synchronistic convergences of archetypally connected phenomena? Where are we seeing that today?
well, just for example, in terms of at the same time that there's upheavals and rebellions going on, just take the last year or two, that happening in Hong Kong. It's also happening in Lebanon. It's also been happening in Venezuela. It was happening in Chile. It was happening in France with the Yellow Jackets, and very similar to in the 1960s, whether it was happening in Berkeley or Paris or in Tokyo or in Mexico City. These were synchronistic, and you could say, well, that's because now we're in, you know, telecommunications and so forth. But this was also true in earlier eras when there was no, you know, the same time that the fall of the Bastille was happening in 1789 in Paris, the mutiny on the Bounty was happening in Tahiti on the other side of the world, and there'd been no contact between those two for over 2 years. So, you know, these are examples of what Jung would call the synchronistic emergence of an archetypal complex or energy in different places at the same time. But it also happens across fields. So at the same time that there's the very, you know, take something like the Me Too movement and how potent that has been as an empowerment. See, the Pluto empowers what it touches. Uranus liberates and you know, seeks to liberate, in this case, women from the oppression of harassment and abuse. Well, same time that's happening, the Black Lives Matter is happening too, within a different, though overlapping, population. At the same time that's going on, you've got you know, things like the Occupy movement or the Arab Spring, or these things happen simultaneously around the world. Now, these are all examples of human, within the human community, of simultaneous, like, convergences of the same energies. But you also see, it's as if nature itself is part of the archetypal, you know, it's part of the anima mundi. The anima mundi is a world soul. It's not just a human collective psyche. And if you think about the same kind of turmoil and intensity of fiery energies that have happened within the human political and social world, at the same time there's extreme fires and catastrophic fires and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes. That's why in the 60s, where the Rolling Stones had the song like "Give Me Shelter," or you know, the storm is threatening, and at the same time, everywhere I hear the sound of marching, charging feet, the time is right for palace revolution. It's happening on all these different, the volcanoes going off.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought I'm glad you brought music and the arts and the artists into it, because I think, and Neumann writes about this in the art and the creative unconscious, right? It's often the artists that are the forerunners of, I think, the emerging, what's wanting to emerge. We often, I think, see it first in the art and the artist. I think of in the 60s, it was Alvin Ailey was the first time ever for an all African American dance troupe to come out. They premiered days before the famous Woolworth Diner episode that really was, you know, hailed as kind of the beginning of that civil rights. You know, we could go, you and I could go, that's a whole other session we could talk about, just, you know, the prophetic nature of art for what is emerging in the collective consciousness, because
Jung wrote about it too. Yeah, that the way the early modernist painters were in some sense anticipating the kind of fragmentation that and deconstruction and primitivization of the psyche that the 20th century was about to go through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think, you know, postmodernism, we saw that deconstruction of meaning and beauty. And what I've been watching, it's interesting because what I've been watching in the dance world is a going back to, you know, some of the ballets that have been put on stage. One of the first ones that made me kind of sit up and take notice, they were premiering Alice in Wonderland, and I went, this is really interesting. In classical ballet companies, Alice in Wonderland, I mean, you know, most of us on this session tonight could go into the archetypal and symbolic significance of that story. This is coming through in the art world. Now we're seeing classical ballets where they're premiering works entirely by women. So the feminine is coming into this in a way that it never has been before in that world. So we're seeing this emergence. And again, I think that goes back to an emergence of a Sophia consciousness that is wanting
Look at
to
all the
emerge.
women who the heroic women in major films in the last decade, right within the popular film world, you know, whether it's Wonder Woman or
Mhm.
uh, the Hunger Games, or the way in which you know, particular figures like Jennifer Lawrence or somebody like that is able to carry a new kind of in 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 fundamental ways where the old sexual stereotypes are being broken through, and the artistic world is crucial as both um, anticipating and opening up the door for. I mean, I think the opening up of uh, gay marriage to the public consciousness, where it happened so rapidly within the last 10, 12 years, compared with what people thought it would be. Gay activists thought it would be even 20 years ago, thought it was. I think one way that happened was through the power of the arts. Um, the Whether it's television programs or films or whatever, helping to constellate a different image.
Yeah, yeah. So as we bring this to a close, I hesitate to bring this question out in the last 5 minutes. If we go a little over, I hope that's okay, because this is a huge question, and it goes more towards your philosophical and a philosophical leaning. But this idea of, you know, we're talking about the astrological influences, we're talking about the archetypal influences, and primarily we've been focused on the collective. And this kind of brings it a little bit, I want to kind of bring it back into, I think, that sense of urgency that I think all of us experience, where you were talking about astrologically, that gravitas, that weight that we feel. Can you talk about the ideas of fate, determinism, self-will? How do we
Yeah.
understand all of that relative to the archetypal, the astrological?
Yes. Um, Excellent question. And in a nutshell, I think of, I mean, the archetypes are multivalent. They have a range of ways in which they can be enacted: shadow sides and light side, or more light, instead of putting it in terms of dark and light, but just in terms of life enhancing or destructive forms of the same archetype or archetypal complexes. And similarly, whether they are more conscious or being acted out unconsciously, that has an influence on how they are enacted. So in some ways, the long journey of towards having a capacity for self-responsible consciousness, autonomy, agency, uh, that capacity, even to the point of creating it in not just human beings in general, but each individual having the capacity and the responsibility to think for themselves and to find and just their own values and so forth. In all these ways, there's been a preparation, I think, for being able to reconnect to the power of the anima mundi, of the archetypal realm, without being completely overwhelmed by it, and instead being a participant, a co-creator with these powerful energies. So one way I think of, for example, the planetary alignments, in some sense, those, I mean, they're completely out of our control. Obviously, the Earth and the planets, we can map these things out years in advance because of the astronomical order of it. But the archetypal energies that are constellated in these cycles are not something that are, I think of them as like great musical chordal structures within, and those are given, but within those musical chordal structures, it's up to us as to what melodies we sing. It's up to us how we dance to that music. It's true that the particular genres of the music may be shaped greatly by our culture and so forth, but it's still, we have, it's a kind of combination of these deep structures are there, but then because of the basic creativity of the cosmos that is in each side of us, there's an unpredictable potential in each moment. And every archetypal energy that gets activated has a kind of, it's called like the iridescent variation of aspect. There's a plurality of ways in which we can bring forth these energies. We can be the terrorist or the courageous reformer.
I mean, that's beautiful. I love how you just described it. I mean, would that be similar to what Jung was talking about when he talked about the crystalline structure of an archetype, where that crystalline structure holds it within a certain, but like a snowflake, like crystals, there's a limitless potential for creative individuality within that structure, right?
Yes, exactly. He was putting his finger on this quality that I think gives us both our capacity for our freedom, but also our responsibility with these energies. And in terms of archetypal astrology, astrology is archetypally predictive, but it's not concretely predictive. A psychic or a clairvoyant might be able to tell you exactly what something,
right.
it may be happening. Or you're going to, have this or that happen, and they may be gifted in such a way that they could nail it with that concrete, specific. But astrology is not like that. Astrology is talking about the larger music of the system. It's the great multivalent archetypal powers that within which, if we know about those, what energies are active at what time, it's like knowing which way the wind's blowing and how powerfully at a given time before we go out surfing or sailing, and also knowing what these energies are and at what time. It's a great navigation tool, but it also allows us to connect our individual life and psyche with the cosmos, which is healing in itself, and to know that what's happening inside me and inside other human beings I know is in some sense rooted in larger cosmic purposes and unfoldings. It's not just me, or it's just not all in my head or in your head. It's right. We're participating in larger fields, larger purposes, within which we have a lot of freedom and responsibility.
And creativity, I mean, I think that,
exactly.
Tapping into that, understanding and working with the creative unconscious individually as well as collectively. So Rick, this has just been an amazing conversation. I wish we had another whole hour.
We probably exhausted everybody after an hour, so that's.
I don't know. Let me just say, no, we still got everybody on board the bus. So thank you everyone for hanging in there. I would like to give anyone an opportunity, just quickly in the last, let's say we'll take, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. If you'd like to type a question in on the chat bar for Rick, please feel free to do that. We'll take another 5 minutes. Rick, we can see you. You're in the total dark, but we can
Yeah,
see you and hear you.
let me
You
turn
want
on
to put
the
a light on?
light a little more.
Okay. All right. So while Rick's turning on the light, those of you who are on with us, if you would like to type something in on the chat bar, I'm afraid if I unmute everyone, we're going to get so much static because we've got so many of you on that we won't be able to hear. But hopefully people can type in on the chat bar. Any questions or comments on any of this? We've covered a lot of ground. Rick has been, these are huge topics this evening.
I can say something that, well, people are thinking about whether to throw in a question or not. It can be very helpful sometimes to listen to music that or experience forms of art that particularly reflect that archetypal complex that it's in the air. So, you know, just to give an example, something like that song that called Under Pressure that David Bowie and Queen did. Well, what's kind of interesting is that David Bowie and Freddie Mercury were both born under the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1946-47. And then they produced that song, recorded it, created it under the very next Saturn-Pluto conjunction when that energy was again constellated in 1981-82, and now we're in the very next conjunction since then. Wow. And so it's a good time to listen to that song. That sense of, I mean, under pressure. You know, it's a perfect metaphor for the kind of energies we've got.
Rick, I don't want to listen to a song about under pressure. I want to listen to something calm.
But sometimes it releases. Well, yeah, you could do that too. But sometimes it's a great release.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I you know, I agree. I hear you. I mean, and I don't think we go to, you know my background, but I don't think we go to music and the arts enough in terms of managing and finding our way through in the times that we're in, because that's where you engage with the archetypes, is, I believe, really engage with the archetypes. So let's see, someone's saying, oh, just another small question, but thank you for getting on the board. I would love to hear you say something about the age of Aquarius.
Right. Well, of course, Jung wrote a bit about that in Ion, those major focuses on the age of Pisces. These ages are something that astrologers have traditionally, associated with the precession of the equinoxes, and where the spring equinox in particular takes place. And at this point, it's in that moving between Pisces and Aquarius, depending on how you calculate it. Everything that I've talked to you about this evening is based on many years of my own and others' research that I feel, kind of competent to speak about. And these cycles that I mentioned are just kind of the tip of the iceberg of the empirical body of data that we've got to be able to talk about these archetypal synchronistic convergences in history and in our own psychological life. When you get to things like the age of Aquarius or the age of Pisces or the age of Aries, these big 2,000 year plus cycles, a 26,000 year cycle, but over 2,000 years for each. I don't feel competent to be able to say with assurance like that this is what is definitely going on. I think what a lot of people, when they talk or sing about the age of Aquarius, I actually was asked to talk to the people putting on Hair, the revival of Hair about 10 years ago, the famous musical from the 60s, where that song, "This is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius," was first. And in preparing the lecture, the one of the writers of the original Hair, and I had a long conversation about it. And uh, he was just picking up things from the hippies off the street there in New York when he was writing it. And but I think when people sing or write about this dawning of the age of Aquarius or the dawning of a new age, they are tapping into a powerful archetype of rebirth. It's the birth archetype, or it's the rebirth archetype, and that can be cosmically projected into this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, or perhaps in fact there is maybe we actually are going into it's again, it's very hard to decide astronomically compared with all the alignments I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The sun, where Pisces is in the sky and where Aquarius is in the sky, they're not clearly demarcated 30-degree segments of the ecliptic. So there's a lot of judgment calls going on there that widely vary by hundreds of years. So there could easily be something going on there, but I'm not competent enough to judge it. But I am competent enough to be able to say we are going through the dying of an old world,
Yeah.
and the possibility of the birth of a new one, and the birth of a new age. But so much will depend on how many people rise to this occasion and
Yeah.
bring their best depth of heart and imagination and compassion and intelligence and skill to this very crucial threshold. So maybe
Well,
that's a good moment to.
that's a beautiful moment and a beautiful thought. And I'm thinking of the many ways in which Jung wrote about the responsibility of the individual, that as the individual individuates and evolves, so goes the nation, so goes the collective. And so I think that we can end this evening with that thought of, and that's what I so appreciate about the archetype of Sophia, is she's about a conjunctio. She's about her drive is about bringing together the polar opposites, and doing that in a way that is embodied in wisdom and compassion and intuition and creativity. That so that I really believe the degree to which we, each of us individually, can root ourselves in that consciousness, root ourselves in that. And like you said, you opened this up by saying, we kind of think and speak these worlds into being. There is a scientific basis for that understanding. And so we, each of us, carry that gravitas and that weight for our responsibility to stay rooted in find our footing in an ethic of wisdom and compassion, even while all of this is swirling about us. Maybe that will help us birth something that we want for our children and our grandchildren going on into the future. So Rick, thank you for your work and your scholarship. Again, we're thrilled and honored, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and stayed on with us for a fast talking and deeply moving in a lot of ways sharing of scholarship and of psyche and soul. Thank you, everyone. Please join us. We will, for those of you who are subscribed for the whole series, we will be launching another Sophia Talk on Saturday morning with Andrew Samuels. It's going to be focused on some of Andrew's work in the political world as well as the psychoanalytical world. So, it'll be at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Saturday morning. I probably will have an extra large mug of coffee in my hand, so feel free to join us for that on whichever coast you're on. Thank you so much. Rick, thank you again. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.